They waited for him to crumble, certain he didn't belong here, certain that one slip would confirm everything they whispered behind closed doors. But when Jamal Carter solved a problem that left even MIT's brightest minds dumbfounded, the entire auditorium fell into a silence so deep you could hear the electric hum of the overhead lights vibrating above their stunned faces, and in that hush, those who once sneered had to reckon with the truth. They tried so hard to deny University of Michigan on a grim morning, the skies heavy with the color of old iron, the cold fluorescence of the lecture hall's lights making every seat in the vast amphitheater look like a surgical theater of judgment, as more than 100 students shuffled in flipping pages, opening laptops, adjusting glasses. Bracing themselves for the sharpness of Professor Evelyn Kingsley's voice, today wasn't a normal lecture, it was an open demonstration, a gauntlet where Kingsley's brutal teaching style would be on display for visiting faculty who sat like a tribunal in the front row ready to dissect not just her performance but the students' every twitch, every hesitation, every mistake, and in that sea of anxious faces, Jamal sat motionless near the middle rows, his dark hoodie pulled low over eyes that refused to meet anyone else's, his fingers methodically spinning a battered pen that clicked in a quiet rhythm, while his notebook lay open, pages covered in tight, organized lines, as neat as marching soldiers. He didn't speak, didn't fidget, because he knew the numbers in his head would do all the talking. But for some, the fact he was black was all they needed to dismiss him as a mistake, a quota, a shadow who'd fade before the hour ended. In the front row, Professor Raymond Aldridge, the department's oldest bulldog, leaned back with a quiet snort, his gaze sweeping across the room until it locked on Jamal, his lips curling into a cruel smirk that said everything he thought. Without needing words, that one there, he won't last, he whispered to Dr. Simmons beside him, and Simmons chuckled, nodding as if it was the most obvious truth in the world, that mathematics had no place for people like Jamal. They let the soft laughter roll over the room, a ripple of small cruelties, so familiar Jamal hardly noticed. But deep inside, he felt the old acid burn he'd carried since the first time someone decided his skin meant he couldn't do the math. The click of Kingsley's heels on tile cut the air like a blade, and instantly every whisper died. The room's breath caught as she emerged from the doorway, a tall figure with silver glasses gleaming in the white light, her posture straight as a blade, her eyes scanning with the precision of a hawk who'd spotted a field mouse. She didn't speak, didn't need to, because her silence alone demanded obedience. She stopped at the center of the room, letting her gaze crawl across each row, slowly, deliberately searching for weakness or the slightest glimmer of disrespect. And when her eyes fell on Jamal, they lingered just long enough to send a silent message clear as glass. "What are you doing here, boy?" Her lips didn't move, but her eyes screamed the question. Then just as quickly, she dismissed him. A flick of indifference, so casual it might have crushed someone else's resolve. But Jamal inhaled the stale metallic taste of the room's cold air and sat straighter because he'd seen that look before and he was done, letting it hollow him out. She turned sharply to the chalkboard, each stroke of her hand swift and violent as she wrote a single word across the blackness. Laplace transforms the letters stark white against the dark board, a warning shot announcing that anyone not ready would be left behind. Instantly, complex equations spilled forth, symbols cascading like a waterfall of ice. Students scrambled to copy them, heads down, pens squeaking across paper, some already blinking in confusion. But not one dared raise a hand, because in Kingsley's world, falling behind was your fault, and your punishment was silent irrelevance. From the front row, the visiting professors gave small nods of approval, impressed by Kingsley's merciless tempo. They believed a great teacher was one who culled the weak, not nurtured them, and they watched Jamal out of the corners of their eyes, waiting for the moment he'd slip, the moment they could file him away as another failure. But Jamal's gaze moved calmly over the unfolding equations, each symbol clicking into place like an old melody he knew by heart. Yet a frown pinched the corner of his mouth as he saw it, a flaw subtle enough to escape most eyes, a misplaced coefficient that twisted the entire problem's outcome, like a hairline crack in glass that would shatter everything if left uncorrected. He looked around, seeing no one else noticing the error, as their pens scratched dutifully. Heads bowed in blind faith, and he felt the bile rise because he hated arrogance, hated mistakes masked by authority, hated sitting quiet while the lie calcified around him. And as Kingsley's chalk squeaked forward, Jamal knew there was no turning back. He raised his hand, the air thickening as he spoke. "Professor, there's a mistake in the transform." And in that instant, every breath in the hall caught, every gaze swung toward him, and Kingsley stopped, her hand frozen midair, the room collapsing into a silence that roared louder than any scream. The silence stretched until it felt like the walls themselves were bending inward, pressing the air so tightly around Jamal's chest that each breath came sharp and bitter. And from the front of the room, Kingsley turned with a slowness that radiated danger, her eyes fixing on him like cold steel, as the chalk in her hand tapped against the board in a staccato rhythm that echoed like a ticking bomb. Her lips curled into a faint smile that didn't touch her eyes, a predator's smile that said, "You just signed your death warrant." And then her voice emerged soft, smooth, dripping with condescension. "You believe there's a mistake, Mr. Ash." Carter, her tone was not a question but a challenge, a gauntlet thrown across the frozen floor. The professors in the front row shifted forward, eyes gleaming as if they could already taste the blood. Some students started to whisper, leaning toward each other, excitement and dread mingling like electricity, humming in the stale air. Jamal felt every eye boring into his skin, every unspoken insult clinging to the back of his neck. But he refused to look away from Kingsley's piercing gaze. He forced his voice steady, because he knew if he faltered now, he'd confirm every bias in this room. Yes, I'm sure the words fell like stones into the cavernous silence. A declaration not just of a mistake, but of his right to exist in this space. Kingsley's smile widened into something razor sharp, and Jamal caught the subtle tensing of her jaw, a crack in her flawless facade. But her tone remained syrupy soft as she gestured grandly to the board. "Why don't you enlighten us, then?" Her words slicing through the quiet like glass, and with a flick of her wrist, she tossed him the piece of chalk. It arced in the pale light, landing in his hand heavier than any weight he had ever carried. Jamal stood slowly, each movement deliberate. His legs felt carved from iron as he stepped into the narrow aisle, his sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, the smell of old chalk dust rising around him like an omen. When he reached the front, the murmurs of the room fell into a suffocating hush. Only the hum of the overhead lights remained pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. Kingsley stood a foot away, arms folded, her eyes locked on him with a look that said, "Go on, prove me wrong." But Jamal didn't hesitate. He lifted the chalk, felt its cool grit press against his skin, and began erasing her error. Each stroke steady, decisive as the air grew denser. Students leaned forward, breaths caught in their throats, some with awe, some with grim anticipation. A faint clicking noise broke the silence. Aldridge's pen tapping against his notebook as he watched Jamal's every move, his face a mask of reluctant fascination and growing unease beside him. Simmons leaned closer, eyes narrowing, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Do you see it? He's actually right." Aldridge clenched his jaw but said nothing, because even he couldn't deny the lines unfolding on the blackboard, perfectly balanced symbols correcting the flaw Kingsley had left hidden. Jamal's hand moved with unbroken confidence, the equations blooming into clarity, so crisp even those who hadn't noticed the mistake began to follow, their eyes widening with each transformation. The tension in the lecture hall shifted from heavy skepticism to electric disbelief, like a storm gathering momentum in total silence. Jamal finished the final line, stepped back, and let the chalk hang loosely from his fingers. He could taste the bitter chalk dust on his tongue, could feel the warmth of the board radiating into his face, but what he felt most was Kingsley's icy gaze boring into him, trying to peel back every layer of his soul to find the crack that wasn't there. She turned to face the board, eyes scanning each correction slowly, her posture as rigid as marble. The room held its breath as if waiting for the ceiling to collapse. When she finally turned back to Jamal, her eyes were cold, but her voice carried an edge so fine it could cut bone. "Well, Mr. How, Carter, it seems you have an eye for details." Her words hollow, brittle, and everyone heard it. They heard the fracture, they saw the faint tremor in the absolute authority she had always wielded like an iron scepter. And the entire room understood something fundamental had just shifted forever. No one dared speak as the silence grew until it was almost alive, shifting and crawling along the rows of stiff-backed chairs until it wrapped itself around every student's throat, squeezing tighter with each second that Jamal stood beside the board, chalk dust still clinging to his fingers. Kingsley's eyes flicked over the corrections once more, her lips thinning into a line that betrayed nothing but her knuckles, whitened against the lectern, as if she were crushing invisible resistance in her palm behind her. The visiting professors exchanged glances, a subtle ripple of discomfort passing among them like a secret current, because they had come to witness Kingsley's brutal precision, not her rare failure, and certainly not a student forcing her to acknowledge it. Jamal turned his head, slightly catching the sharp scent of disinfectant rising from the floor, a sterile reminder that this place was meant to be clinical. Cold, merciless, and yet right now it felt like the center of a gathering storm. Then Kingsley moved with a sudden swiftness, sweeping her hand across the chalk tray, sending a small cloud of dust into the harsh white light. She began writing again, symbols cascading down the board at a dizzying pace, each line more tangled than the last, each equation folding into the next like a labyrinth designed not for learning, but for humiliation. Her voice rang out sharp and cool as steel. If you believe you're ready for this level of mathematics, let's see how you handle something more appropriate for a doctoral candidate. Her words carried a dark promise that this time he would not walk away unscathed, as the symbols multiplied, sprawling into complex integrals and impossible transforms. The collective gasp of the class rose like a wave breaking against the walls and then receded into a stunned quiet. Jamal's eyes locked onto the expanding maze on the blackboard. He felt his pulse thudding against his ribs, but his face remained an unreadable mask. A thin bead of sweat traced a slow line down his temple, catching the cold light before falling to the floor. Would this finally be the limit he had feared? The question stirred like a whisper deep in his chest, but he smothered it before it could take root. The overhead lights flickered softly, casting brief shadows across Kingsley's face. As she stepped back, arms folded, a queen waiting for the pawn to stumble. Jamal stepped forward, lifted the chalk again, its weight familiar now like an extension of his hand, and began tracing a path through the storm of equations. Each movement deliberate, precise, the ticking of Aldridge's watch in the front row, loud as a drum beat, counting every second. Jamal refused to fail. As the chalk danced across the board, students leaned in eyes wide, trying to keep up with the flurry of symbols that seemed to bend and shift like a living thing. Jamal's breathing steadied each inhale, filling his lungs with stale lecture. Hall air tinged with the faint scent of Kingsley's floral perfume, a mocking reminder of her presence right at his shoulder. But he pressed on. He folded layer after layer of the problem back on itself, unweaving its complexity into something that made sense. Symbols falling into line like soldiers obeying his silent command in the front row. Simmons let out a low, disbelieving whistle, earning a sharp glare from Kingsley. But even that couldn't break the focus of those who now watched with rapt attention. Because Jamal wasn't just solving the problem. He was rewriting the balance of power in the room with every stroke. At last, the final line appeared clear and irrefutable. Jamal set the chalk down, the sharp click ringing across the lecture hall like a gunshot. He turned to face Kingsley, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of his defiance. And in the breathless quiet that followed, a single thought cut through his mind like a blade. Would she finally admit the truth, or would she cling to her crumbling facade? He felt the heavy stillness of every eye upon them, the tension stretching thinner and thinner until it seemed the slightest word might shatter it all. A faint tremor passed through Professor Kingsley's jaw. Though her expression stayed composed, her eyes lingered on the board. Each symbol Jamal had drawn now glowing with the undeniable clarity of correctness. Yet she kept scanning the lines over and over, as if the sheer force of her scrutiny might reveal a hidden flaw that simply wasn't there behind her. The room held its breath, the buzzing light overhead giving off a low hum that vibrated through the silence like the pulse of something alive and restless. Aldridge's watch ticked on, each second landing like a hammer blow, reminding everyone how long it had been since Kingsley's surety first began to crack. She turned suddenly to the professors, seated at the front row, her eyes sharp and searching, but all she found were raised brows and thinly veiled surprise. None of them dared meet her gaze too long, and in that quiet evasion was an unspoken confession. They saw what she saw, they knew what she knew. The mistake wasn't Jamal's, it was hers, and the realization pressed against her ribs like a weight she couldn't shake. Her voice came out low, measured, almost gentle, but it was a tone so foreign to her students that it cut through them like a sudden gust. "You seem confident, Mr. Carter?" Kingsley said the words tasting bitter on her tongue. But before Jamal could answer, she turned back to the board chalk already in hand, as if she could erase the moment with more symbols, more complexity, more impossible hurdles. She began sketching a new problem, each line more tangled than the last. Equations colliding and fusing into forms. Even advanced graduate students would balk at the room, seemed to shrink around the figures she drew. Every stroke echoing off the walls until the air felt tight and thin, like it might collapse at any moment. Students shifted in their seats, eyes darting between the board and Jamal, who stood motionless, his breathing deep and steady, though the rising heat under his collar betrayed his own silent battle with the pressure coursing through his veins. A question coiled inside him like smoke. How many more traps would she set before she accepted the truth? Aldridge leaned forward, his eyes wide, the scent of burnt coffee drifting faintly from the cup he clutched so tightly. The plastic rim had bent, his lips parted, but no words came. He had expected to see arrogance in Jamal's stance, expected the first signs of panic. Yet all he saw was a quiet resolve, an unshakable focus that made something cold ripple down his spine. The students behind him were no different. Some pressed fists to their mouths. Others sat forward so far they were almost out of their chairs, and every one of them felt the same thing. Kingsley felt it too. The shifting tide that no amount of chalk could wash away. Jamal stepped closer to the board. His hand moved to the chalk almost lazily, but his eyes were sharp, hungry, dissecting every symbol Kingsley had laid out like a predator, sizing up its prey. And when he began to write, it was with a calmness that made the tension crackle. The first transformation fell into place. Then the next, each stroke flowing without hesitation, like a river carving through stone. The scribble of chalk was the only sound in the room, save for the shallow breaths of those who watched, unable to look away. Symbols tumbled into order under his touch. Once chaotic equations folding into a clear, straight path forward. And as each line resolved, Kingsley's face grew harder, her eyes glittering with something close to desperation. Though her voice stayed soft like silk hiding the steel beneath. "You think you can keep this up, don't you?" Her words slid across the silence, almost a whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the lecture hall. But Jamal didn't answer. He didn't need to. The numbers spoke for him louder than any voice ever could. And when he finished the final line, when he set the chalk down with a gentle click that resonated like a final note in an endless symphony, the entire room exhaled as one, a sound low and ragged that echoed with awe and fear, because they all knew what they had just seen, and none of them would ever forget it. Professor Kingsley's fingers curled so tightly around her chalk that the faint crack of its tip breaking echoed like a gunshot across the stunned silence of the hall. She didn't flinch, didn't let the betrayal of her own hands show on her face. Her eyes stayed fixed on Jamal, standing there with a stillness that seemed impossible under the weight of so many eyes. But the longer the room stayed quiet, the more her silence began to resemble surrender, a thought that made her heart thunder with a rage she couldn't mask. The electric hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder now, buzzing overhead like a chorus of whispers, pointing out the crack in her once absolute authority. Aldridge felt sweat beat at his temples, his pulse fluttering unsteadily. He tried to catch Kingsley's eye, seeking some reassurance that the order he knew would return, but she ignored him, her attention locked on Jamal's equations, as if by sheer will she might yet find a flaw hidden in the neat lines. But the board offered only a reflection of her own mistake. And each time she read it, the truth settled deeper into her bones, like an icy hand tightening its grip. Students began to shift nervously, the hush splintering into fragments of whispers that slipped like smoke through the rows. "Did you see that? He fixed it perfectly." Someone murmured, the words cutting through the stale air like knives. In the center of it all, Jamal stood, his breath slow and deliberate, his gaze unblinking. As it rested on Kingsley, he could feel the weight of every expectation, every prejudice, every sneer and soft laugh that had greeted him when he first stepped into this class. Yet they felt distant now, like a storm he had already weathered. He wondered quietly if they realized how different things were now, if they could feel the ground shifting beneath them, the same way he did, because he knew this wasn't just about a math problem. It was about the silent war fought in every narrowed glance, every dismissive smirk, every whispered doubt. And for the first time, he felt the tide had turned. Kingsley straightened slowly, the motion deliberate, her posture rigid like a statue carved to ward off the truth. She stepped forward, her heels clicking on the cold tile, each sound ringing in the oppressive hush. She reached for a fresh piece of chalk, her movements as smooth as they were desperate, and she began to write again, faster this time, lines tangled with symbols that sprawled across the board like a web designed to trap him. She worked with a feverish intensity, the chalk squealing beneath her hand until the symbols towered over Jamal, complex enough to make even the guest professors in the front row lean forward. their eyes wide with disbelief. One let out a low whistle that cracked the silence in half. Is she really trying to bury him with that? The professor's voice was quiet, but it carried enough wonder to ripple through the room. Jamal watched the problem unfold. His eyes narrowed, but not with fear. His heart beat calmly as if the storm raging in the room couldn't touch him. The scent of old wood and dust hung thick around him, grounding him in the moment. His mind a blade honed sharper than the question Kingsley threw at him. When she finally stepped back, the chalk falling from her hand and bouncing once on the floor, her eyes glimmered with a cold triumph. "You claim to know so much, Mr. Carter," she said softly, "but there's always something you don't know." Her voice curled around the class like smoke, daring anyone to doubt her again. But Jamal stepped forward, his hand outstretched, his fingers closing around the chalk. Kingsley had dropped the small tap of it, lifting off the floor. Sounding louder than a shout, his eyes never left hers. And for a fleeting moment, a shadow of hesitation flickered across her face as if she'd glimpsed something she couldn't quite name. Then Jamal turned to the board and began to write each stroke of chalk, deliberate but unhurried, the symbols unfolding from his hand like music played from memory. The chaos of Kingsley's problem dissolving piece by piece until the impossible seemed not only possible, but elegantly simple. And in that unfolding, every spectator felt the same breathless question echo through their minds. How can he see what no one else does? The chalk moved like a blade carving through fog, each stroke clearing the confusion Kingsley had woven so meticulously and revealing a path so stark in its clarity that the students watching felt as if the air itself had been sliced open. Jamal didn't pause, his hands steady, his mind unwavering as lines of solution grew across the board like vines reclaiming a wall. His breathing slow and controlled, each inhale bringing the bitter scent of old erasers and cold stone into his lungs, grounding him even as the weight of dozens of eyes pressed against his back. Professor Kingsley's chest rose and fell more quickly now, a subtle tremor in her fingers betraying what her face refused to show. The guest professors exchanged glances, some leaning closer to catch every line he wrote, others shifting uncomfortably as they realized that the boy they had dismissed without thought was now commanding the room without a word. Aldridge clenched his jaw so tightly it ached, his gaze flicking between Kingsley and Jamal, unable to decide if he should feel outrage or fear, because what Jamal was doing was not only solving the problem, but unmaking the quiet certainty on which their power had always rested. The classroom seemed smaller, but at each line Jamal completed, the walls closing in with a hush so profound it magnified every sound, the distant ticking of a clock, the shallow breathing of students, the soft scratch of chalk on slate. Kingsley's eyes tracked every movement, the edges of her composure fraying as Jamal's answer neared completion. And still he did not rush. Each transformation appeared with the elegance of someone who didn't need to search for the path because he had already memorized the terrain. He paused once to glance at his work, his eyes cold and clear, and in that brief stillness, an unspoken question echoed through every mind in the room. Will he falter, or will he finish what no one else could? Then Jamal resumed writing, the final steps cascading down the board like a waterfall gathering momentum until the last symbol settled into place with a quiet finality. He set the chalk down, the small clink of it landing in the tray, resonating like a bell, tolling the end of an era. His shoulders straightened, his eyes lifted, and he turned to face Kingsley, whose lips parted slightly, as if words had come to her but died before reaching her tongue. She stepped forward, eyes scanning the board in desperate search for a mistake, something she could seize upon. But there was nothing. Each line precise, each step undeniable. Murmurs rippled through the students, a low current of awe and disbelief, their eyes darting between the board and Jamal, as if trying to reconcile the image of the quiet boy in the gray hoodie with the brilliance that had just unfolded before them in the front row. One of the guest professors whispered to another, "My God, he didn't just solve it. He solved it better than any of us could." The words fell like stones into the silence, heavy with a dawning realization that the balance of power in this room had shifted irreversibly. Jamal's gaze met Kingsley's, his eyes steady, not with arrogance but with the unshakable calm of someone who had nothing left to prove. The sharp electric buzz of the lights above hummed like a distant storm, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for Kingsley's response. But she stood frozen, hands clenched at her sides, eyes locked on the truth that now covered her board like a mirror, reflecting back every prejudice, every assumption, every unspoken rule she had enforced for years. And for the first time in her career, she had no words to control the narrative. Aldridge's breathing sounded loud even over the ringing silence, each exhale betraying a tension that spread like a sickness across the front row, where professors sat shifting uncomfortably, their confidence slipping from their eyes as they stared at Jamal still standing near the board, his back straight. The chalk dust faint on his fingers like war paint that spoke of a battle already won. The students' gazes moved from the equations to his face, some wide-eyed in wonder. Others with the dawning realization that every assumption they had carried into this room was now laid bare and shattered. Professor Kingsley's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed together in a line so thin it looked carved from stone. Her mind a storm of disbelief and desperation as she searched every digit and symbol Jamal had laid down for a flaw, a misstep, some hidden error that could reassert her authority. But the harder she looked, the more undeniable the truth became, and each second of silence felt like a blade twisting in the quiet power she had always wielded with such precision. She stepped closer to the board, the sharp scent of stale chalk hanging in the air, each breath reminding her that this room, once her unquestioned domain, now felt foreign and hostile. In the back rows, whispers rose like a cautious breeze, soft but insistent, the sound of students recalibrating their ideas of what was possible, of what someone like Jamal could achieve. The girl in the third row, who had once hidden behind her notebook, now stared openly, eyes bright, with the thrill of seeing a truth that felt bigger than any lesson in a textbook, while others who had scoffed when Jamal raised his hand now shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet his gaze, because they knew what their silence had meant, what their soft laughter had implied. Kingsley's voice finally broke the hush, brittle as cracked glass. "Well, if you're finished, Mr. Carter, why don't you take your seat?" Her words slow and deliberate, but everyone heard the quaver hiding beneath them, the betrayal of a certainty slipping beyond her grasp. Jamal said nothing, moving calmly to his seat, the soft scuff of his sneakers on the cold tile floor. The only sound, his face still, eyes focused straight ahead, and in that unbroken poise he held more power than Kingsley had in her entire lecture. Aldridge leaned forward, his face pale eyes sharp, as he hissed toward Kingsley, "You can't let this stand. You have to show them he's not special." His words low and urgent, as though trying to conjure a lifeline out of thin air. But Kingsley ignored him. Her gaze pinned on Jamal with a conflicted fury, because deep inside she knew this was not a mistake she could erase with a harsh word or a humiliating question. This was the moment everything shifted, the moment her rule of fear cracked. One student dropped their pen, the small clatter echoing like a gunshot, making everyone flinch before the silence swallowed them again. And Jamal exhaled slowly, the faint metallic taste of adrenaline lingering on his tongue. His mind already moving beyond this moment, already seeing the next challenge Kingsley would throw, because he knew she wasn't finished. He knew the old guard never yielded without a final desperate strike, and he welcomed it, each breath steady, each heartbeat, a promise that he would not break. The electric hum overhead grew louder, like the world itself leaning in to hear what would come next. And Jamal's eyes flicked briefly to Kingsley's, a subtle question glinting in his gaze. "Do you still believe I don't belong here? Or have you finally seen the truth?" You tried so hard to bury Kingsley's heels, tapped a restless staccato on the cold tile as she retreated to the lectern, her hand trembling ever so slightly as she flipped through the thick stack of papers she kept, like weapons, her eyes darting over the lines of dense problems that had brought countless students to tears in years past. Problems designed not just to teach, but to break, to separate the few she deemed worthy from the many she discarded without hesitation. And yet, as she scanned the pages, nothing looked sharp enough to cut Jamal down to size each equation, now dull and impotent against the quiet certainty he had brought into her classroom. A soft cough rippled from the third row, a boy shifting in his seat, his eyes flicking from Jamal's still profile to Kingsley's rigid posture, the boy's mind whirring with questions he dared not ask out loud. How had this happened? How could someone they'd all dismissed so easily stand so tall while their feared professor looked so close to breaking? The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once, casting a brief shadow over the board, where Jamal's equations stood untouched, flawless like monuments that Kingsley could neither tear down nor ignore. Professor Aldridge leaned forward, sweat beading at his temple, his voice barely above a whisper as he hissed, "You have to end this now, Evelyn. You can't let him walk away thinking he's untouchable." But Kingsley's lips tightened, her jaw, working as though every word she might have spoken got caught behind her teeth, because she understood what Aldridge refused to accept. The more she pushed Jamal, now the more obvious her desperation would become, and that kind of weakness would not only destroy her control over this class, but tarnished the reputation she had spent her entire career building. Jamal rested his hand lightly on the desk, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his fingertips, the faint warmth left by the day's earlier classes still radiating into his skin, his thoughts steady and unhurried even as he sensed the eyes of every student on him, even as he heard the erratic cadence of Kingsley's breathing from across the room. He let the hush linger each second of silence, a reminder that he no longer played by the rules they had written to keep people like him out. Finally, Kingsley's voice rang out, strained but measured. "Then let's see if you're as exceptional as you think, Mr. Carter," she said, each word falling like a stone into the silence. "I will give you a challenge beyond anything you have seen in this class, a problem taken from the archives of the International Mathematics Olympiad, one so difficult it has broken students far more experienced than you." Her eyes locking onto his with a venomous calm as she placed a fresh sheet of paper on the lectern. A ripple of excited dread rolled through the class, a girl near the back whispering, "He'll never solve it, right?" But her words sounded hollow even to herself because the memory of Jamal's earlier triumph was still too fresh, still too sharp, and in the front row, Aldridge Ahmedban, his eyes gleaming as he savored the impending spectacle he thought would finally shatter Jamal's impossible poise. Jamal stood without hesitation, moving with the quiet certainty of someone who had decided long ago that fear would never be his master. The smell of dry paper and chalk heavy in the air as he stepped to the front, Kingsley's hand trembling almost imperceptibly as she handed him the problem, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second, a silent clash of wills passing between them. He took the paper, his eyes scanning the labyrinthine question Kingsley had chosen, each symbol and nested equation unfurling in his mind like a tapestry, a subtle question flickering through his thoughts. Did she really believe this would stop me, or was this just the only move she had left? And with a slow breath, he stepped up to the board, his hands steady as he raised the chalk, the classroom so quiet it felt like the world itself was waiting for his answer. Jamal's hand moved with a quiet grace across the board, the chalk leaving pale, deliberate lines in its wake, each stroke a note in a symphony only he could hear as he reconstructed the sprawling labyrinth of the Olympiad problem, with a precision that made the air in the room seem to thin, every breath shallow as if the entire class feared that even the slightest disturbance might shatter the fragile charged stillness settling over them, and in that silence, the faint, rhythmic hum of the overhead lights felt like the loudest sound in the universe. Kingsley's face was a mask of stone, but her eyes betrayed the chaos inside, flicking to each new line Jamal wrote with an urgency she tried to hide her mind, working feverishly to follow his transformations. But the more he wrote, the clearer it became that she was no longer in control of the board, no longer the keeper of unassailable knowledge, and that terrifying realization settled into her bones like ice. A shiver she fought to suppress even as Aldridge watched her from the corner, with a smirk that held both mockery and disbelief. Students leaned forward, notebooks, forgotten pencils, frozen mid-sentence, because the unfolding solution in front of them felt like witnessing something that should have been impossible, like seeing a storm calm itself with a single breath. And for the first time in Kingsley's class, a sense of collective awe replaced the fear that had always hung in the air like an unspoken rule. A girl in the second row bit her lip, her eyes wide as she wondered how many other hidden giants like Jamal had they laughed at without ever knowing their true power. The numbers and symbols poured from Jamal's mind as if he were merely recalling an old memory rather than creating something new. His mind a quiet blaze of clarity and purpose as he worked, and still that subtle question echoed in his thoughts. Why did they always think brilliance came packaged in the same tired mold, the same familiar face, the same expected voice, when truth had no color, no accent, no pedigree, only the cold certainty of its own existence? Kingsley shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, the click of her heel on the tile like a gunshot in the stillness, her eyes darting to Aldridge, to the rows of students, to the clock ticking relentlessly toward the end of class, knowing with every second that passed without Jamal faltering. Her grip slipped further away, and the empire she had built on intimidation and perfect control teetered closer to collapse with every unbroken line of his solution. Jamal's chalk paused at the final step, his eyes scanning the entire towering structure he had assembled across the whiteboard, the faint scent of chalk dust sharp in the back of his nose as he considered every connection, every coefficient, every careful transformation until he found it complete, flawless, undeniable. He set the chalk down with a soft click that seemed to reverberate through the lecture hall like a tolling bell, a quiet declaration that the impossible had been conquered. A breathless moment passed as Kingsley stepped forward, her eyes tracing each symbol with frantic precision, her mind desperate for a mistake, a crack, any flaw she could seize to reclaim her authority. But the harder she searched, the more obvious it became that she was standing before something unassailable. And a low gasp escaped a student in the back row as the truth rippled through the class. Jamal Carter had solved the unsolvable and made it look effortless. In that silence, a question rose in the back of Jamal's mind, quiet but unrelenting. Had this always been the only way to force them to see him, not with words or pleas, but with a truth so pure it left no room for their old assumptions to hide behind? And as Kingsley stepped back, her hand falling limply to her side, he realized that answer had been written long before he stepped into this room. The chalkboard loomed behind Jamal like a monument to something larger than any one person. The fresh, stark white lines of his solution glinting under the cold fluorescent lights that buzzed like static in the air. Every curve and symbol a testament to his quiet, relentless resolve. And for the first time in her career, Kingsley felt the disorienting weight of her own silence pressing down on her shoulders, as if the very authority she had once wielded so effortlessly was slipping through her fingers. With every passing second, she failed to find her voice. Aldridge shifted in his seat, his earlier smirk gone, replaced by a pinched, uneasy expression, as he stared at the solution sprawling across the board, his eyes darting to Kingsley, then back to Jamal, as though searching desperately for anyone to say what he could not bring himself to admit, that the student they had dismissed, the student they had mocked, had just upended every certainty they clung to, and the knowledge of it made the air thick, as if everyone in the room was suddenly breathing through water. A chair squeaked in the back of the lecture hall, the sound unnaturally loud against the hush that blanketed the class, and the girl who had once tried to stifle her laughter at Jamal's presence now covered her mouth with trembling fingers, her eyes wide as she replayed every cruel thought she had let slip in whispers to her friends, realizing that each one had been a brick in the invisible wall they had tried to build around someone whose brilliance they were too blind to see. Kingsley's hand hovered in midair, fingers twitching slightly, as if reaching for words that refused to come, and Jamal watched her impassively, the faint scent of old chalk mixing with the sterile odor of the lecture hall's recycled air as he stood quietly, his mind a strange calm in the storm of emotions he could feel radiating from every direction. Because this moment wasn't just about a problem on a board, it was about the shifting of an entire world he'd been told he had no place in. Then in a voice that came out smaller than anyone expected, Kingsley finally spoke the words ragged at the edges, as if each syllable had to be dragged from a throat raw with unacknowledged fear. "Very well, Mr. Carter. You have demonstrated your competence." The words hung in the air like something broken, a desperate attempt to reassert control, even as everyone in the room could hear how hollow they sounded. And Kingsley's eyes flickered with a brief wounded panic as she realized the applause she expected did not come. Instead, a soft, uncertain clapping started from the back, spreading hesitantly but gaining strength with each student who joined until the walls themselves seemed to vibrate with the rhythmic thud of hands coming together, not in rebellion, but in recognition, in an unstoppable wave of respect that Kingsley could neither direct nor suppress. She turned sharply, her heels clicking like gunshots across the floor as she fled to the lectern, her face pale and tight. But the sound followed her, rising louder, surging forward as though the room itself had come alive. Jamal's gaze swept the room, taking in faces once twisted with smug amusement, now lit with something like awe. And in that moment, as the heat of the lights bore down on his skin and the faint, burnt metal taste of adrenaline lingered on his tongue, he wondered quietly whether this was how change had to begin. Not with permission, not with polite requests, but with an undeniable truth carved into the very bedrock of the old rotting certainties they clung to. The applause rippled through the cavernous hall, like a tide breaking through a dam, rolling past the rigid rows of seats and echoing off the high ceilings until it became something alive, something fierce and undeniable. And Jamal stood perfectly still at the center of it, his heart pounding like a silent drum, even as his face remained composed, the overhead lights flickering slightly as if the very building recognized the gravity of the moment unfolding within its walls. Kingsley's hands gripped the lectern so hard her knuckles blanched to a ghostly white, her eyes darting back and forth across the room, as if hoping anyone would break ranks and restore the order she had always relied on. But the students she once ruled with cold precision now looked at her with a brittle, watchful distance, their faces reflecting a quiet realization that the world they'd accepted without question was suddenly irrevocably changed. The smell of dry eraser dust lingered in the stale air, mixing with the faint ozone of overworked electrical circuits. As Aldrich shifted again the chair beneath him, creaking a note of discomfort that only amplified the uneasy hush settling over the visiting professors in the front row, each of them shifting uncomfortably as they watched Kingsley's aura of control unravel thread by thread with every passing second. Jamal refused to shrink under the weight of their silence. A soft voice quivering, yet insistent, rose from the middle rows, cutting through the hush with a note of fragile hope. Does this mean we can really stand up too? The question hovered like smoke curling through the hall and embedding itself in every heart, because everyone understood it wasn't just about mathematics or a single victory. It was about the possibility of challenging the quiet, corrosive certainties that had kept so many seated, so many silent for far too long. Jamal's eyes flickered to the speaker, a young woman with wide brown eyes and hands that trembled slightly as she gripped her notebook like a lifeline, and he gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a quiet shiver through those watching. In that gesture, there was a promise, a spark that dared them to imagine a world where brilliance wasn't measured by skin color or whispered pedigree, but by the raw, undeniable truth that anyone who dared to rise could claim their place. Kingsley's voice cracked as she tried to retake control, the words forced and brittle. Let us continue. Please open your textbooks to chapter 11. But the command landed with a dull thud, ignored by eyes that now lingered on Jamal. Not out of disbelief, but out of something she had never seen before in this room. Respect mingled with a restless curiosity that whispered, if he can do this, what else have we been told we cannot do? The hum of the overhead lights filled the silence. Kingsley couldn't break a low electric drone that carried Jamal's own quiet question through his mind as he felt the burn of every eye in the hall. If one truth can change a room, how many truths will it take to change the world? And as he lowered himself back into his seat, the chalk dust still clinging to his fingers like a badge, he knew the answer would not come easily, but it was a question worth every breath. The murmur of disbelief and quiet awe drifted in waves through the auditorium long after the final applause had died away, like the aftershock of a quake that no one could unfeel. And Jamal sat there with his notebook open on his lap, pen resting between his fingers as though it were a dagger forged from every slight, every whispered doubt, every moment he had been told, without words or with them, that he would never stand where he now stood. And as the sterile hum of the ventilation system pulsed overhead, he realized the air felt different, charged brittle, as though the walls themselves were trying to decide whether to collapse or hold up something new. Kingsley's eyes kept darting to him like she was searching for a flaw, a crack, some proof that the perfect equations he'd written were a fluke, a stroke of luck rather than the culmination of every sleepless night and silent war he had waged in a world that rarely offered him the courtesy of believing he belonged here. And though her face wore a mask of cool composure, the small twitch at the corner of her mouth betrayed the fracture running deep into her confidence. The faint scent of burnt coffee from the judge's table drifted through the hall, a bitter undertone to the silence that clung to everyone like a second skin. And Aldridge, who had once leaned back with smug certainty, now sat hunched forward, his eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line as he traced Jamal's steps on the blackboard over and over, each line of chalk, a nail in the coffin of the assumptions he had carried with the casual arrogance of a man never forced to prove himself. A single cough snapped the stillness like a twig, and Jamal's pulse quickened, but his hands remained steady because he understood now that the greatest strength was not in pretending. Fear didn't exist, but in moving through it, letting it wash over him like cold rain and emerging sharper, clearer, unbreakable. What will they do now that their comfortable illusions have cracked? The thought slithered through Jamal's mind even as he kept his gaze calm, even as he watched Kingsley's shoulders stiffen with each heartbeat, and in that silent question, he found an unexpected certainty, because every eye that turned to him now, every mind that dared to wonder what else might be possible, was another brick dislodged from the old walls that had once kept people like him outside looking in. From the far back of the room, the soft hiss of a camera focusing cut the quiet again, the lens capturing the moment not as a footnote but as a turning point, a story that would ripple beyond this hall to every student who had ever felt the weight of a gaze that said, "You don't belong," and Jamal tilted his head slightly, meeting the lens with eyes that refused to bow because in that unflinching stare he offered not just proof of his victory, but an invitation to every unseen dreamer who might come after him. And when Kingsley finally found her voice, it came not as the whip crack of command, but as a thin, wavering thread. "Let's move on," she whispered. But even she seemed to know there was no moving on from what had just happened, because the truth had been written in chalk and silence, and it could never be unwritten. The echo of Kingsley's halting words still hung in the air like smoke, refusing to disperse as Jamal slowly closed his notebook, his fingers brushing across the worn cover that had carried his quiet revolution from crowded library tables to this grand auditorium where the rules were supposed to be unshakable. And as he looked up, he could see the subtle shift in the room's energy, the way students who had once avoided his gaze now held it uncertain but no longer dismissive, as if the moment had cracked open, something none of them had dared to name before today. The electric hum of the overhead lights buzzed louder than before, amplifying the smallest sounds, the scrape of a chair leg, the flutter of pages turning, and Kingsley stood rigid near the board. Chalk dust smudged faintly on her sleeve, like the mark of a duel she had lost, even if no one dared to say it out loud, and the silence that she had once commanded like a conductor now pressed against her shoulders, heavy, suffocating, undeniable. Aldridge cleared his throat, the dry rasp breaking the standoff, but even he didn't speak. His eyes flickered to Jamal with a mix of confusion and reluctant respect that left him blinking more than once, as if trying to reconcile the boy he had dismissed with the mathematician who had just outmaneuvered every trap set before him, and Jamal wondered how many more times he would have to do this before people like Aldridge stopped looking so surprised. The faint, sharp scent of fresh marker drifted through the room as Kingsley uncapped a black pen with trembling hands determined to regain control by shifting everyone's focus to a new problem, a new battlefield. But Jamal sensed it was already too late because the students leaned forward, not in fear but in fascination, eyes darting between the blackboard and him, silently comparing each new symbol to the unwavering precision he had demonstrated moments ago. Will they remember this feeling tomorrow? Or will comfort lull them back to old habits? The question wound through Jamal's mind like a low current, steady and insistent, even as he kept his face calm and his breathing slow, because he understood the power of repetition, of refusing to fade into the background, even when silence seemed easier. A rustle of notebooks signaled the class returning to a semblance of normalcy, but Kingsley's voice, when it finally came, was thin, brittle, stretched to the point of cracking, as she explained a new equation with lines that seemed to waver with every stroke of the marker. And Jamal realized she had lost more than a problem today. She had lost the unchallenged certainty that once radiated from her like an invisible wall. And as he sat there, the numbers and symbols dancing before his eyes like old friends, Jamal knew he was no longer just solving for himself, but for every student who had ever been asked to prove they deserved to be here. Every kid who had seen a door close quietly before they could even knock, and in that knowledge, he found a quiet power stronger than any applause. Jamal's pen moved idly across the margin of his notebook, lines curling into abstract shapes as the lecture droned on, Kingsley's words tumbling out in a clipped monotone that failed to reestablish the grip she once held so easily, her voice straining for authority, yet never quite reaching the unchallenged dominance that had defined her reign. And the realization dawned in the quiet exchanges of glances between students that the invincible fortress she had built had finally cracked wide open for all to see. A faint whiff of burnt coffee from someone's thermos drifted through the stale air, sharp and bitter, mingling with the hushed tension that refused to lift, even as Kingsley worked through a new problem at a punishing speed meant to overwhelm, but now exposed her own growing desperation, each flourish of the marker, punctuating not her mastery, but her fear of losing control. And Jamal watched carefully, his dark eyes steady and unblinking, because he understood this was not merely a personal victory, but a shift that could ripple far beyond these four walls. In the back row, a trio of students who had once smirked at his quiet presence now leaned forward, their eyes darting between him and the board, a silent acknowledgement passing among them that the narrative had changed forever. And Jamal felt the weight of those new expectations pressing against his chest like an invisible hand. Did they finally see him as more than a statistic? Or would they cling to the old comfort of doubt when the next challenge arrived? The low hum of a distant floor buffer seeped through the closed doors, a muted vibration reminding everyone of the world still turning. Outside this tense space, and Kingsley hesitated, for the first time in her explanation, the marker pausing midair as if searching for an escape. A brief flicker of something almost human crossing her eyes before she masked it with a rigid nod. But the moment was enough. Every student saw it, the sliver of uncertainty in the one who had demanded certainty from everyone else. Aldridge's eyes tracked every movement, his lips tight with an expression Jamal couldn't quite decipher. Resentment, perhaps, or reluctant admiration, but he offered no interruption, his silence more telling than any praise. And Jamal wondered if even this man, who had looked through him like glass so many times before now, questioned the unspoken rules he once believed were immutable. The question threaded through Jamal's mind like a pulse: will this moment hold when the headlines fade and whispers grow quiet again? Because he had seen too many times how change flickered brightly, only to be snuffed out by comfort and fear, and he refused to let himself become a fleeting curiosity, remembered only as an exception to the rule. As Kingsley lowered the marker and turned back to face the class, her face pale beneath the cold white lights, she opened her mouth to speak but hesitated once more. And in that hesitation, Jamal found a silent confirmation that what had been done here today could never be undone, no matter how hard anyone tried to forget or rewrite the truth now carved into every mind present. The sunlight slanted through the tall windows of the lecture hall, streaks of pale gold, cutting across rows of hushed students who sat as though frozen in the aftermath of what they had just witnessed. The once unquestioned rule of Professor Kingsley now lying shattered among the drifting dust motes, and Jamal's breathing slowed as he absorbed the magnitude of what had unfolded. The crisp scent of chalk dust lingering in the still air, like the faint memory of an old battle. Kingsley's voice, when it finally returned, sounded brittle and thin, words breaking as they left her lips as if they cost her more than she could bear, her eyes darting over the sea of faces that no longer reflected unthinking obedience, but something sharper, more alive, a silent demand for truth that she could not evade, and every syllable she forced out only deepened the raw wound in her authority that Jamal's unwavering defiance had carved open for all to see. The old radiator beneath the window clicked and hissed softly, each metallic sound echoing like a distant drum beat marking the death of a myth. And as Jamal's gaze swept the room, he noticed eyes that had once looked past him, now fixed with new awareness, the invisible weight he had carried for so long, lifting ever so slightly as the balance of power shifted, fragile but undeniable. And a thought took root inside him, like a question he dared not say aloud. Was this the moment that would ripple outward beyond these walls and crack open other doors? Aldridge stood near the door, arms folded tight against his chest, the deep lines in his face betraying the conflict he tried to hide, and for the first time he seemed to measure Jamal. Not as a mistake to be corrected, but as a force to be reckoned with, and Jamal felt a flicker of something close to satisfaction, though he knew better than to mistake one crack for a collapse. The quiet was broken only by the steady ticking of the clock high above them, its second hand sweeping relentlessly forward as if to remind them that time had not stopped for their reckoning. And Jamal wondered if Kingsley heard it too, if it sounded to her like the footsteps of every student who would never again accept the old lines drawn to keep them small, or if she would close her eyes and pretend this day had never happened, praying the world outside would remain blind. A subtle warmth radiated from the beam of sunlight now touching Jamal's desk, a small mercy in the sterile chill of the lecture hall. And as he sat there, hands folded loosely on his notebook, he felt the certainty settle in his bones that he had not just solved an equation or won a battle, he had taken a stand that would echo long after the chalk dust cleared in the whispers of students who dared to believe they too could rise when every voice told them to sit down. Kingsley cleared her throat once more, her words thin and hollow as she attempted to resume the lecture. But everyone knew the room had changed forever, and Jamal remained seated. His presence an unspoken reminder that the old rules no longer held sway, that talent and determination could not be confined by prejudice, that truth once revealed would not be hidden again, and in that silence the promise of something larger than victory pulsed quietly between every heartbeat. The afternoon light turned softer, blurring the edges of the old lecture hall, as if the world itself needed a moment to catch its breath. Golden rays filtering through tall windows, and dust dancing slowly in the hush that followed the day's quiet revolution. The sense of finality settling over worn wooden desks and the pale chalkboard, where Jamal's numbers still lingered like faint scars of a battle, already drifting into memory, yet refusing to fade completely. Outside, leaves stirred in a lazy breeze, the faint scent of rain mixing with the warm promise of summer, A whisper that the world beyond these walls continued to spin, yet somehow spun differently. Each rotation colored by the knowledge that a single voice refusing to bow could tilt the axis of expectation, a reminder carried in the silence of every student who walked through the doors after heads held a touch higher than before. Jamal stepped into the quiet corridor, each footstep echoing with the weight of everything unspoken. The cold metal of the stair rail warmed beneath his hand as he descended past bulletin boards cluttered with flyers for clubs and lectures, each square of paper fluttering softly in his wake, like muted applause. And he felt the strange serenity of a storm finally past, yet still alive in the minds of those who bore witness. He paused at the exit, the sun low on the horizon casting long shadows across the campus green, and he stood there for a breath, listening to the breeze rustling leaves overhead, the distant hum of students' laughter, and the steady drumbeat of his own heart, carrying him forward into a world forever altered, where numbers could still speak truth and courage, could still redraw the lines no one thought could ever move, and he smiled just a little. In the quiet aftermath of every clash between prejudice and truth, there lies a simple, unshakable lesson that brilliance knows no skin color, no pedigree, no inherited privilege. And those who dare to stand unbowed in the face of condescension remind the world that ability cannot be confined by the narrow visions of those who believe they alone set the rules. Jamal's journey through whispered doubts and overt disdain proved that real strength comes not only from knowledge, but from the resolve to let actions speak louder than the judgments of others. Each of us will face moments when we're underestimated before we even begin. Yet it is what we do next that defines not just our place in the world, but the boundaries of what others will dare to imagine after we've walked our path. Let truth, perseverance, and courage be the only voices you need.